The galaxy was watching, waiting for peace to finally be achieved. The largest intergalactic summit was being held on the neutral planet of Valterra, where leaders from various alien species gathered to negotiate terms for peace. Among them was Princess Zephyra, a small yet brave alien princess from the war-torn planet of Zorvath. Her people had been at war for centuries, and her dream was to unite the fractured factions of her species and end the endless cycle of violence. Zephyra was different from the other leaders. While most of the council members were cold and calculated, obsessed with power and control, she was passionate, kind-hearted, and determined to do whatever it took to bring peace. She had worked tirelessly to organize the summit, believing that this was her chance to make a real change. But little did she know, the very people she trusted would be the ones to betray her. The summit was meant to be a historic moment for diplomacy, but everything changed when the planet's skies suddenly darkened. Without warning, a fleet of warships appeared overhead, their weapons primed and ready. The peaceful summit turned into chaos. The alien leaders quickly revealed their true intentions, and the council members who had once supported Zephyra turned against her. The attacks were brutal. The mercenaries, hired by a powerful faction within the council, unleashed an onslaught, targeting Zephyra specifically. She was quickly surrounded by assassins, her bodyguards slaughtered in seconds. In a moment of desperation, the council members, who had promised her protection, ordered her execution. As the battle raged around her, Zephyra found herself running, her heart pounding with fear. The peaceful talks had turned into a massacre, and she had been betrayed by the very people she had trusted. It was clear now that she was nothing more than a pawn to them, disposable and unimportant once her usefulness had run out. Amidst the carnage, Zephyra barely managed to escape the clutches of the assassins. She stumbled through the dense alien jungle, the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing behind her. Her breath was shallow, her legs shaking from exhaustion, but she pushed on. Every step was a battle against the pain, the blood soaking into her clothes, but the thought of being abandoned and left to die by those she had once called allies burned brighter than any physical wound. With no one left to trust, Zephyra was forced to rely on herself. The betrayal had shattered her, but it also ignited a spark of defiance within her. She couldn't let them win. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for her people. Her only hope lay in finding safety, in escaping the mercenaries who would surely hunt her down. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jungle. The once vibrant and peaceful landscape now seemed hostile, as though the planet itself was rejecting her presence. She had no idea where to go, no clear path to follow. She was lost, alone, and on the run. Every rustle in the bushes made her heart race with fear, every shadow seemed to hide a threat, and yet she pushed forward. At that moment, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shake, and a faint rumble echoed in the distance. She stopped, listening. The noise grew louder, closer. It wasn't the sound of more mercenaries, it was something else, something human. The ground vibrated with the sound of an approaching ship, low and rumbling like thunder. Zephyra froze, torn between relief and terror. Could it be? Could there be someone who would help her, someone who would risk their life to save her? Or was it just another trap set by her enemies? The sound grew louder, now unmistakably close. Her heart raced as she pressed her back against a large tree, trying to stay out of sight. From the jungle, a figure emerged. At first it was just a silhouette against the twilight, but as the figure came closer, Zephyra could see it clearly. A man. A human. The man's armor was battle-worn, his posture weary but determined. His face was hidden under a helmet, but there was something about the way he moved, like a soldier who had seen too much, a fighter who had learned how to survive against the odds. His eyes scanned the jungle, alert, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. For a moment, Zephyra thought she might be imagining him, her mind playing tricks on her as exhaustion took hold. But then, as if sensing her presence, the man's head turned toward her hiding spot. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't there to harm her. "Are you Princess Zephyra?" the man's voice was rough, yet surprisingly gentle. Zephyra barely managed to nod, too exhausted to speak. She was too weak, too vulnerable, but she didn't want to show it. The man's eyes softened for a brief moment, though he quickly regained his cold composure. "I'm Jax," he said simply, pulling out a medical kit from his pack. "We don't have much time. You need to come with me." She stared at him for a long moment, unsure whether to trust him. But her instincts told her that this man wasn't here to kill her. There was something about him, something in his eyes that told her he wasn't like the others. She had nothing left to lose. With a deep breath, Zephyra took a step toward him, her legs shaking beneath her. Jax immediately moved to support her, his strength helping her stay upright. "There's no time," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to move now." And just like that, the betrayal she had suffered faded into the background, replaced by the promise of an unlikely savior. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zephyra allowed herself to believe that there might still be hope. A human soldier, the kind of person her people had once considered beneath them, had just become her only chance at survival. As they disappeared into the jungle, the distant sounds of pursuit grew louder. The mercenaries were close. The real battle had just begun. Jax had always been a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. That's how it had been for years, no questions asked. His life was simple, defined by the mission, the fight, and surviving. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't interested in saving anyone. He had lost too much to care. His family, his home, all gone in the endless wars. The only thing that mattered now was completing his assignments and keeping himself alive. But life had a funny way of throwing unexpected challenges at people. Jax had been deployed to Valterra, a planet at the center of the galactic conflict. It wasn't supposed to be a combat mission. The higher-ups called it a recon mission, just to observe the situation. But Jax knew better. Recon was always code for something bigger, something more dangerous. When he stepped off the transport ship onto the rocky terrain of Valterra, he didn't expect it to turn into a battlefield. His orders were clear: help rescue any survivors and secure the area. But no one had prepared him for what he was about to face. As he moved through the dense jungle, Jax could feel the tension in the air. The planet was alive with movement, alien creatures rustling in the trees, the distant hum of engines from above. But something was off. The energy wasn't right. He had seen enough battles to know when something was about to go wrong. His instincts were screaming at him to be careful. Then he heard the sounds: screams, gunfire, explosions. The kind of chaos that could only mean one thing: war. His mission had just shifted. He wasn't here to observe anymore, he was here to fight. Jax pressed on, activating his cloaking device to move through the jungle unseen. He had no idea who was on the other side of this conflict, but he knew one thing for sure: he needed to find out. The chaos he was hearing wasn't just random skirmishes. It was organized. And someone was in trouble. As he moved closer, the jungle seemed to grow darker, the sounds of battle more intense. That's when he saw them: mercenaries. Well armed and well trained, they were chasing something. Or rather, someone. He caught a glimpse of a small figure running through the trees, struggling to move with the weight of a battle that was clearly too much for her. Princess Zephyra. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew she was in trouble. Jax's eyes narrowed as he observed the scene. These weren't your average soldiers. These were trained killers, mercenaries hired to hunt down someone. And from the looks of it, they had no mercy. He quickly assessed the situation. There were too many of them for him to take on directly. But he wasn't a fool. He knew how to think on his feet. He waited until the mercenaries had passed, then followed the small figure. The jungle was dense, and the sounds of the battle soon faded as he moved through the underbrush, staying hidden in the shadows. His mind raced. Who was she? Why were they after her? What had she done to deserve this kind of treatment? Then, out of nowhere, she collapsed. Jax moved in without hesitation, slipping past the trees, his boots barely making a sound as he approached the wounded princess. She was lying on the ground, her breathing shallow, blood staining her clothes. She was young, small, and clearly out of her element. Jax's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't just any runaway. She was someone important. The question was, who was she? And why were they trying to kill her? He knelt down beside her, his hand hovering over her injury. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open for a moment before they closed again. Jax cursed under his breath. The princess was in bad shape, and time was running out. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. He had been trained not to care, to shut off the emotions. But something about her, the fear in her eyes, the way she fought to survive, pulled at him. He had seen enough people give up. But she wasn't giving up. Even in this condition, she was still trying to survive. "Stay with me," Jax muttered, more to himself than to her. He quickly scanned the area, making sure no one was around. His hands worked fast, tending to her wounds as best as he could with the limited supplies he had on him. But it was clear she needed more than basic first aid. She needed help, and fast. Jax didn't know what to do next. The mercenaries were still out there, and they would be back. They would be looking for her. He couldn't let them find her. He had to move her, get her to safety. But to where? Valterra was a hostile planet, and anyone who would help her would also become a target. For a moment, Jax hesitated. He had no personal stake in this. She wasn't his problem. He could just walk away, leave her to her fate. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his own lost people, their faces, their names, and the way they had been left to die in the same cold, heartless way. He couldn't do that to her. He couldn't just walk away. With a grunt of determination, Jax lifted the princess into his arms, carrying her as best as he could through the thick jungle. Every step was a challenge, his muscles ached, his heart was racing, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The air around him seemed to thicken with danger. Every rustle in the trees made his nerves jump. Jax kept his eyes peeled, his weapon ready, his senses on high alert. He was on his own in this alien world, but for the first time in a long while, he had a reason to keep moving forward. "Hold on," he whispered to the princess, even though she couldn't hear him. "I'm not letting you die here." The jungle around them seemed endless, but Jax pushed on, determined to get her to safety. Every second counted. And with each step, Jax realized that something had shifted inside him. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was personal. The jungle seemed to close in around them as Jax moved deeper into the thick vegetation, carrying Princess Zephyra in his arms. He moved quickly, each step calculated, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The sounds of distant gunfire still echoed in the air, a constant reminder that the mercenaries were hunting them. But Jax pushed those thoughts aside. His only focus now was getting Zephyra to safety. The weight of her body in his arms was a constant reminder of the stakes. She was wounded, barely conscious, and relying on him for survival. Jax knew he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The jungle, with its dark shadows and unfamiliar terrain, was both a refuge and a danger. They needed shelter, and fast. Jax's mind raced as he searched for a place to hide. The jungle stretched endlessly, with trees towering above them, their thick leaves blocking out much of the sunlight. He knew there were places where he could find cover, caves, abandoned structures, or even a simple thicket of dense trees that could conceal them long enough for him to tend to her injuries. Finally, after what seemed like hours of moving through the dense jungle, Jax spotted an overhang of rock. It wasn't much, but it would do. He carefully laid Zephyra down on the ground, making sure she was as comfortable as possible despite her injuries. Her breath was shallow, her skin pale, and Jax could see that the wound on her side was still bleeding, though not as badly as before. He knew he had to act quickly if he was going to keep her alive. He immediately began treating her wound, using the medical supplies he had with him. The kit was basic, but it would have to do. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed. Despite the strength she had shown when fleeing, she was now completely vulnerable, dependent on him for her survival. Jax didn't mind. In a strange way, it felt right. It had been so long since he had cared for anyone, and now, here he was, doing everything he could to keep this alien princess alive. He thought back to the cold, emotionless soldier he had once been, the soldier who had seen too much, lost too much, and had shut off his feelings. That man didn't care about anything or anyone. But now, as he worked to save her life, Jax realized that something inside him was changing. Zephyra stirred slightly, her eyes flickering open for a moment. She looked up at him, her gaze hazy, but there was something in her eyes that made Jax stop for a moment. She was scared. Not just because of the mercenaries, but because she didn't know him, didn't understand why he was helping her. To her, he was just a human soldier, a stranger who had no reason to care. Yet, he had chosen to risk everything to save her. Her voice was weak when she spoke. Why are you helping me?" Her words were barely audible, but they struck Jax with an unexpected force. Jax paused, his hand still on the wound. He wasn't sure how to answer. What was he supposed to say? That he had no choice, that it was just another mission. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't just about survival anymore. I don't know, he said honestly, the words feeling strange coming from his mouth. I guess I just can't let you die. He looked down at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. You're not the enemy. She blinked slowly, as if trying to process what he had said. Her brow furrowed, confusion clouding her face. But, you're human. I'm Zervathian. We're supposed to be enemies. Jax couldn't help but let out a short, dry laugh. Yeah, well, that's what they tell us. But it's not that simple, is it? She seemed to consider his words, her gaze drifting away for a moment. She was still weak, but there was something in her expression that told Jax she was trying to understand him. Trying to understand why he was different from the other humans she had been taught to fear. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Why would you risk your life for someone like me? Jax didn't have an easy answer for that. The truth was, he had no idea why he was doing it. It wasn't because of some grand mission or some sense of duty. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just tired. Tired of fighting for a cause that didn't matter, tired of seeing people suffer. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted to make a difference for once. Maybe helping her was the way to start. You don't have to understand, Jax said finally, his voice quiet but firm. You just have to trust me. For a long moment, Zephyra didn't say anything. She simply looked at him, her face filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Then, slowly, she nodded. She wasn't sure she understood, but in that moment, she was willing to trust him. As the hours passed, the two of them settled into an uneasy silence. Jax kept watch while Zephyra rested, her breathing becoming steadier as he continued to care for her. The jungle around them was silent for the moment, the distant sounds of battle now a mere echo in the background. Jax knew they couldn't stay here long. The mercenaries would be searching for them, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. But for now, in this brief moment of calm, Jax couldn't help but feel a sense of connection to the alien princess he was trying to save. They were from two different worlds, two different species, but in that moment, they were united by a common cause, survival. Zephyra's eyes fluttered open again, this time with more clarity. How much farther? She asked, her voice stronger. Jax glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Not far, he said. We'll keep moving at first light. Stay with me. She nodded, and for the first time since they had met, Jack saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Maybe they had a chance after all. Maybe, together, they could survive this. The jungle was eerily quiet when Jax woke up. The air was thick with humidity, the sounds of distant creatures muffled by the dense canopy above. He had kept watch through the night, his senses constantly alert, listening for any sign of the mercenaries or anything else that might pose a threat. But the silence of the jungle was unsettling. It felt like the calm before a storm. Zephyra lay beside him, still unconscious, her breathing more steady than before. Jax had managed to get her wound cleaned up as best as he could, but he knew she wasn't out of danger yet. She was young, barely more than a child by her people's standards, and her life hung by a thread. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Jax carefully checked his surroundings once more. The mercenaries could be out there, searching for her. The longer they stayed in one place, the higher the chance of them being discovered. They couldn't afford to waste time. But he couldn't leave her. Not yet. His mind drifted back to their conversation from the night before. He still couldn't understand why he was helping her. She was a princess, a member of a royal family from a distant alien race. Jax had always been taught to see them as the enemy. But now, as he looked at her, lying helpless and vulnerable, he couldn't help but feel a strange connection. Something inside him had shifted. In the past, Jax would have left her to fend for herself. He would have seen her as nothing more than an obstacle, someone who might be useful to him or someone to ignore. But now, he felt a sense of responsibility for her, a need to protect her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she reminded him of the things he had lost. Maybe it was because he saw her as a symbol of hope, a chance to make up for all the mistakes he had made in the past. Jax was lost in thought when Zephyra stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked confused, disoriented. She blinked several times, then looked around, as though trying to make sense of her surroundings. It was clear she wasn't fully awake yet, but there was a spark in her eyes, a spark that hadn't been there the night before. Where am I? Her voice was weak, but the fear was still there, hidden beneath her words. It took her a moment to focus on Jax, and when she did, a flash of recognition passed over her face. "You're safe," Jax said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "For now." Zephyra's brow furrowed as she tried to sit up, but she winced in pain, her hand instinctively clutching her side. Jax quickly moved to support her, gently pushing her back down. "You need to rest. You're not ready to move yet." She shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "I have to keep moving. They'll come for me." Jax looked at her for a long moment, his expression softening. "I know. But we need to be smart. We can't just run blindly. We need a plan." She glanced around, her gaze scanning the jungle as if looking for something, anything that would give them a clue about their next move. Her eyes were wide with uncertainty, but there was something else there too, strength. Even in her weakened state, she refused to give up. "I don't have much time," Zephyr said, her voice steadying. "My people, my father will be looking for me. I can't stay hidden forever." Jax nodded, understanding the urgency. She was right. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that the mercenaries would find them. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he wasn't sure where to go next. He had no knowledge of this planet, no idea where to find safety. And even if they managed to escape the mercenaries, there were other dangers in the jungle, wild animals, hostile factions, and the unforgiving terrain. But Jax wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not with her depending on him. "I'll get you out of here," he said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll find a way." Zephyra didn't respond at first. She just stared at him, as if trying to figure out if he meant it, if he could actually do it. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that she was willing to trust him, at least for now. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jax felt a strange warmth spread through him at her words, but he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to get soft. He had a job to do. "We need to move," he said, his voice hardening again. "Can you walk?" Zephyra nodded, though her movements were slow and hesitant. She still looked pale, and the wound on her side hadn't healed enough for her to be fully mobile, but she was determined to push through. Jax helped her to her feet, supporting her as they began to move through the jungle once again. As they moved, Jax couldn't help but notice how different she was from the person she had been when they first met. She had been scared, vulnerable, desperate for survival. But now, despite her injuries, she was standing tall. Her determination was stronger than ever, and Jax could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she refused to let anything stop her. They moved slowly, Jax constantly on the lookout for danger, while Zephyra did her best to keep up. She leaned on him for support, but Jax could tell she was doing everything she could to stand on her own. It was clear that she wasn't used to relying on others, especially not a human. The jungle seemed to stretch on endlessly, but Jax knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. They were still too vulnerable, too exposed. The mercenaries were still out there, and time was running out. But as they walked, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. There was a bond forming, an unspoken understanding. Jax realized that in helping Zephyra, he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Hope. And in that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to keep her alive. The sky above them was dark, filled with heavy clouds as the air seemed to thicken. Jax and Zephyra had been on the run for days, moving through dense jungle, crossing rivers, and avoiding mercenaries at every turn. The harsh reality of their situation had finally set in. They were being hunted, and there was nowhere left to hide. Jax could feel it in his bones, the inevitable confrontation was coming. The mercenaries had been closing in for hours. Their footsteps were unmistakable, the sound of high-tech boots echoing through the jungle, carrying a promise of destruction. They were relentless, like wolves on the hunt, and they wouldn't stop until Zephyra was captured or dead. Zephyra was exhausted, her body bruised, her movements slow. But her spirit remained unbroken. She had endured more than anyone should have to, and yet she kept pushing forward. Jax admired her strength, but he also knew how dangerous their position was. Every step they took brought them closer to a fight they might not survive. They had reached an old, abandoned outpost, a relic from a war-long past. It was a crumbling structure, now overtaken by the jungle, but it offered a small chance of shelter, a place to make their stand. The walls were thick and decaying, but it could provide a defensive position long enough for them to make one last stand. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Jax motioned for Zephyra to follow him inside, and together, they moved cautiously into the building. The air inside was stale, and dust covered everything, but it was a haven of sorts. Jax quickly began checking the perimeter, ensuring there were no easy ways in or out. They didn't have much time. "Zephyra, listen to me," Jax said, his voice low but urgent. She was sitting against one of the walls, her eyes still alert but clouded with exhaustion. "We're out of options. They're going to find us. I need you to promise me something." Zephyra's tired eyes met his, her expression unreadable. She knew what was coming. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it comes down to it," Jax began, pausing for a moment as he struggled to find the right words, "if it's you or me, you have to run. You have to survive. Your people need you." Zephyra's face twisted with shock and disbelief. "No, Jax, I can't leave you. I won't." "Listen," Jax said, cutting her off, "you're important. You're more important than I am. I've already lived a lifetime. I've seen things, lost things. But you, He took a deep breath, fighting to keep his voice steady. You have a future. You're the key to everything. You have to go. Zephyra shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I won't leave you behind. I won't lose you, not after everything we've been through. Jax placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. You don't have a choice, he said softly. If I don't make it, you have to carry on. You have to survive. For both of us. There was a long, painful silence between them. Zephyra's gaze dropped to the floor, her fists clenched. She wanted to argue, to fight him on this, but deep down, she knew Jax was right. She was the last hope for her people. The only way to stop the war, to ensure peace, was for her to survive. The burden of that knowledge weighed heavily on her heart. Before she could speak again, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside, sharp and methodical. Jax's eyes widened with recognition. The mercenaries had found them. Get ready, Jax said urgently, his voice now all business. He checked his weapons one last time, his hand trembling slightly. He wasn't afraid. He had faced death before, but this time was different. This time, he was fighting not for survival, but for something greater. For someone else. Zephyra stood, her face set in determination. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice firm, but Jax could hear the uncertainty beneath her words. I know you don't want to, Jax replied, his gaze softening for a brief moment. But you have to. Promise me. Zephyra hesitated, her chest tightening. I promise. The sound of footsteps grew louder, drawing closer. The mercenaries were closing in. There was no more time for talk. Jax positioned himself by the door, his eyes focused on the narrow entrance. Zephyra stood beside him, her back pressed against the crumbling wall, trying to steady her breathing. They were both preparing for the inevitable. And then, they came. The mercenaries burst into the outpost with the force of a thunderstorm, their weapons raised and aimed at the two of them. Jax moved with lightning speed, firing a shot before they even fully entered. The first mercenary dropped, but there were more, too many to count. You have nowhere to run, one of them shouted, their voice filled with hatred. Surrender now, and we'll make it quick. Jax didn't answer. He kept firing, his movements precise, his mind sharp. He knew they didn't have long. Zephyra was behind him, her hands shaking but ready to fight. She had no weapons, but Jax could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. Then, Jax's worst fear came to pass. As he turned to reload, one of the mercenaries managed to flank him. The soldier's blade pierced his side, and he gasped in pain, barely able to keep his balance. Blood poured from the wound, and he stumbled backward. Zephyra screamed, her eyes wide with horror. No. Jax gritted his teeth, struggling to stay on his feet. The world around him was spinning. He had one last thing to do. One final act. Zephyra, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Go. Now. Before she could protest, Jax pushed her away, shoving her toward the exit. Run, Zephyra, he ordered, his voice cracking. Promise me. With tears streaming down her face, Zephyra hesitated, but only for a moment. The sound of gunfire filled the air as she ran, her heart breaking as she looked back. She knew Jax had made his choice. And now, it was up to her to survive. As the mercenaries closed in on him, Jax knew it was over. But he didn't regret a thing. He had done what he could, given everything he had. And now, it was her turn. With one final breath, Jax made his last stand, his sacrifice ensuring that Zephyra would live to see another day. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning debris. Zephyra's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted through the jungle, her body aching, her mind racing. The pain in her side was almost unbearable, but she pushed through it, forcing herself to run. She couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything Jax had done for her. She could still hear the gunfire in the distance, echoing through the trees, each shot a reminder of what she had left behind. Jax's sacrifice. The life he had given to ensure her survival. The thought of him, standing there, fighting to the end, filled her with grief. She wanted to turn back. She wanted to help him, to save him, but she knew it was too late. There was nothing more she could do. Tears blurred her vision as she pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort. She could hear the mercenaries in pursuit, their footsteps growing louder, closer. They wouldn't stop. They would hunt her down until there was nowhere left to run. But Zephyrah couldn't afford to be caught. She couldn't let Jax's sacrifice be in vain. Her mind flashed to her people, her father, and the war that awaited them. She was the only hope left. The only one who could stop the destruction, the only one who could bring peace. If she could just make it out of this jungle, she could warn her people, rally them against the forces threatening to destroy everything. She could make sure that Jax's death meant something. With one final burst of strength, she broke through the thick trees and into a clearing. Ahead of her, she saw the distant outline of a small settlement. She knew it wasn't much, but it was a place to hide, a place to regroup. Zephyrah didn't stop to catch her breath. She kept moving, her feet pounding against the earth, her heart hammering in her chest. But as she neared the settlement, a sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a low, rumbling growl, followed by the snap of twigs underfoot. Zephyrah froze, her body tensing as her instincts kicked in. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that danger was close. Turning slowly, she scanned the darkening jungle around her. The growl came again, louder this time, and then, out of the shadows, it appeared. A massive creature, its fur dark as the night sky, eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. It was unlike anything Zephyrah had ever seen, its massive form towering over her, muscles rippling beneath its sleek coat. Its fangs were long, sharp, and glistening in the dim light, and its claws dug into the earth with each step it took. Zephyrah's heart raced, her mind desperately searching for a way out. She couldn't fight this thing, not in her current state. But she couldn't just run either. She had to think. She had to survive. The creature growled again, taking a step closer, its eyes fixed on her. Zephyrah's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature's gaze shifted, and it hesitated, as if sensing something else. Zephyrah's mind raced. She didn't understand what was happening. Was the creature a threat, or was it simply curious? Was it a wild animal, or something more? Suddenly, the creature lowered its head, its body tensing as it growled again. It wasn't attacking. It was warning her. Zephyrah took a step back, unsure of what to do. And then, she realized something: the creature wasn't here to kill her. It was here to protect her. Just as the realization hit her, a sharp crack echoed through the jungle, followed by the sound of rushing footsteps. Zephyrah turned, her heart skipping a beat. The mercenaries had found her. They were closing in, their weapons aimed at her, their voices shouting commands. The creature stood between her and the mercenaries, its massive form blocking their path. It was clear that it wasn't about to let anyone pass. Zephyrah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the mercenaries hesitate, unsure of how to proceed. But before they could react, the creature charged, moving with terrifying speed. It was a blur of motion as it collided with the first mercenary, knocking him aside with a single swipe of its claw. The other mercenaries raised their weapons, but the creature was too fast, too powerful. In a matter of seconds, the battle was over. The mercenaries lay unconscious or dead, their weapons scattered across the ground. The creature stood tall, its chest heaving with each breath, its eyes locked on Zephyrah. For a moment, Zephyrah didn't move. She could hardly believe what had just happened. The creature had saved her. And now, she had a chance, maybe the only chance, to survive. Zephyra approached cautiously, unsure of what to do. The creature didn't move, but it didn't seem hostile either. She slowly extended her hand, her fingers trembling, and to her surprise, the creature lowered its head, allowing her to touch its fur. The moment her fingers brushed against it, she felt a strange connection, a sense of calm, a bond between them. It was then that she understood. This creature wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something she couldn't yet comprehend. But in that moment, she knew she wasn't alone. She had a protector. She took a deep breath and turned toward the settlement in the distance. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way to warn her people, to make sure they knew what was coming. And she had to honor Jax's memory. He had given everything for her to live, and now, she would make sure that his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The creature followed her, staying by her side, as if guiding her toward her destiny. Zephyra's mind was filled with thoughts of the future, the war, the battles ahead, but for the first time since she had met Jax, she felt a sense of hope. The dawn was breaking. A new chapter was beginning. And with the creature at her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. Together, they would find a way to save her people, to stop the war, and to honor the sacrifices that had been made. The new dawn had arrived, and with it, the promise of a future where hope still burned bright.